before this starts. Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar about repair lowers carbon emissions, exploring the impact of consumption emissions, co-organised by the European Right to Repair campaign and the Restart project. I am very happy to see so many of you attending on this hopefully beautiful Friday, wherever you are. At least you're in Brussels, it's very sunny. My name is Chloe Mikolajczak, and I am a campaigner for the Right to Repair campaign, which is a coalition of more than 18 members in 18 European countries, including civil society organizations, repair businesses, community repair initiatives, and public institutions fighting for longer lasting and more repairable products, both at European and national level. I'm sure if you're here, you all know that we have a serious problem. Over 200 million smartphones are sold every year in Europe. That's nearly 7 every second. And each time one of these phones is made, it creates between 40 and 80 kilos of CO2. And where are the old ones going? Well, the answer is pretty simple, mainly into the bin. E-waste is the fastest growing waste stream in the world. And this is why we actually just launched a new campaign called the 10-Year Smartphone, which asks Europe to be a true leader and ensure that every new smartphone put on the market lasts for at least 10 years. It is disguised as a fake product launch. We'll share the website in a minute. And it highlights what would be needed for phones to last at least 10 years. Because extending the lifetime of smartphones by just 1 year could save 2.1 million tons of annual CO2 emissions. And going further and extending the lifetime from currently on average 3 years to 10 years would save 6.2 million tons annually by 2030, which means a 42% reduction of the overall footprint of the products. So that is a lot of statistics, and I apologize, but I still think it's important to know. So we'll share the link in the chat, and I encourage you to take a look at the campaign and sign our letter to the European Commission. Before I pass the mic to my co-host, a bit more information on the practicalities of this event. The webinar will last for about an hour and it will be recorded. So if you have to drop out at some point, the recording will be available. We'll start by a short presentation from our guest, and then we'll move on to a Q&A, including both questions from us and hopefully questions from you too. So to ask these questions or also to share any technical issues, and even if you want to introduce yourself, you can use the chat function on the right. I'm seeing a lot of hellos from all over the world already, which is very nice. And I will now pass it on to the co-host of this event, Ugo Valori, who is the co-founder and policy lead at the Restart project, which is a founding member of the Right to Repair campaign. So Ugo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chloe, and good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending where in the world you are. I am very, very excited that today we begin officially our celebrations for the upcoming International Repair Day, which happens on Saturday, the 16th of October. And what a better start to delve into the theme of this year, which is repair lowers carbon emissions, in celebration of the upcoming COP26 talks and more awareness that after the IPCC most recent report, that we really are in trouble and we must act now. And consumption is a key aspect that we can all tackle and ask our governments to tackle more than they have so far. What better way to start the celebration than to run this webinar with Professor John Barrett. We're extremely happy to welcome Professor Barrett here today to share his expertise on this topic. Barrett is the chair of the Sustainable Research Institute at the University of Leeds, where he undertakes research into sustainable consumption and production modeling, carbon accounting, and explores how we could best transition to a low carbon future. Barrett is also director of the Centre for Industrial Energy Materials and Product and a co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre. He's a leading voice in the UK efforts towards a low carbon economy and has recently worked with DEFRA, advising on PAS 2050 and the IPCC, authoring essential reports in his field. And in fact, he's just launched as a co-author a new report called Positive Low Energy Futures, which we'll share the link to in the chat. just launched by the Center for Research into Energy Demand Solution, CREDS. John, you have a short introductory presentation for us, answering the key question for today, which is what are consumption emissions and why it's important to look at them specifically. And then we'll have a series of questions that we prepared to go into more detail, which will be followed by ample time for questions from the audience. John, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. And I hope that share screen has worked and you can see the slide in front of you. It's a pleasure to talk to you today about what I believe to be an extremely important issue, which has been widely neglected as part of our solutions to reduce our emissions as rapidly as we possibly can. So for many years now, I've developed an approach with my research team to understand the impacts of everything that we consume in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. And lots of you will probably know, but in this country, we're responsible for the emissions which happen inside this country. So those are our territorial emissions. And in this chart, you can see that the total emissions in the UK is about 473 million tonnes. However, we obviously live in a global economy and we trade products, and there were emissions released during the making of those products. And we are highly reliant on imports in the UK. And if we calculate the amount of embodied energy, so the energy required to make those products, for items that are consumed in the UK, we can add on another 364 million tonnes. And so basically it means that the impact of our consumption is virtually double the emissions which actually happen inside this country. And this is a major challenge for one key reason, that we are focused on reducing the emissions inside this country, but we do not have a legal duty to deal with the emissions that happen outside. And I'll show why this is so important when we think about consumer products and goods in the next couple of slides. So we're able not to just provide that big picture of these flows, we actually understand the flows of specific product groups, so over 106 of them, and how they're traded in the world and how they travel through each country before they get to the UK, and the impact that they have in both being produced and transported for our consumption. And what we find overall is that a lot of the emissions associated with our domestic heating, with our transport, and so on, happen inside the UK. And that we are importing this enormous amount of embodied energy, which ends up in consumer products, but also in government for the products that they buy to function, be it for the NHS or other important services. And it is this import of consumer manufacturing goods, which predominantly come from outside the UK, totaling 192 million tonnes each year. And as you can see, if we look at the chart on the right, for lots of individual products, like our footwear, like telephone equipment, clothing, for our electrical goods, nearly all of the impact is happening outside the UK. So for electrical items, for example, around 95% of our embodied emissions happen outside. So why is this important? When we come to look at policies in the UK, and we've done a lot of work with the UK government on how to use resources differently, we get the response sometimes that, well, it doesn't really matter because it won't reduce our emissions. Therefore, we can't claim a sort of victory. We can't claim that we're reducing emissions. However, that really doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter where the emissions are released. A ton is a ton is a ton, and it'll have the same climate impact wherever it happens. So therefore, the way that we choose to account for our emissions can actually affect our focus on particular policy options. And if we're going to be truly global about it, then we need to focus on how we can reduce the impact associated with all these manufacturing products. So I have one further slide on this. And what we've done is we have modeled what our emissions would be from all our consumer items all the way up to 2050. And we've had a look to see where, if we reduce and change our patterns of consumption, whether the reduction would happen inside the UK or outside the UK for a whole range of policy options. The food stuff here is mainly about shifts to plant-based diets and reducing meat consumption and calorific intake. All the other ones are about consumer products. And if you look at the product longevity on the consumption side, we show that we could reduce our emissions by 25 million tonnes if we focus on using products longer. And clearly, one of the key areas to do that is our ability to ensure that they can be optimized for as long as possible and that they can be repaired is an essential part of achieving that product longevity. I'm going to leave that there and then respond specifically to the questions then, which I believe I'm about to face.
Thank you, John, for this introduction. It's great to see finally a visualization of the direct positive impact that extending the lifetime of our products can have. It's often really overlooked, and we need to help everyone get a better understanding of that. I will go straight into one of our first questions, which is, are there specific hotspots for consumption emissions, and how do academics find or measure this?
Yes, I'll maybe do the first bit first. The measurement of this is not easy. I believe we have over 1 billion data points in our model, and because obviously all items are lots of items are traded, we need to have a detailed picture of the production patterns of every single country in the world and how each sector relates to every other sector. And these are done by building what's known as multi-regional input-output models that understand how each industry interacts with every other industry to produce the final products which are consumed all over the world. So it's an incredibly complex task to be able to understand this. But our ability to do that has improved exponentially over the last 10 years with the growth of these models. We're not the only ones in the world to operate these kind of models, but there's only about 4 or 5 of them that exist because they're so intensive in terms of understanding the impacts. And what it shows us, I think, is there's some key consumer products which have considerably large impacts. And electrical items, the fact that that was mentioned earlier on, is one of the key products and one of the key areas where we can reduce our impact by using that product longer. We also see huge opportunities in textiles and clothing. And then one, I think the product which we probably use most inefficiently out of all products is probably the car. It sits there for 95% of the time without being used. It often has only a 25% occupancy rate. And obviously it requires energy to run. So in essence, we have a product which has a huge amount of embodied energy, but we are using at such a low utilization rate. And the fact that we have a pattern of ownership where we all have one sat on the drive, sat on the road outside our houses, which is barely ever used, really shows the inefficiency of our current system of buying products as opposed to potentially delivering them as a service when we actually need them. And I think that cuts across a whole range of different product groups as well.
So the second part of the question was, how do academics find or measure these hotspots? I don't know if you wanted to add anything specific to that.
Yes, so I suppose in essence, a few things. I suppose the models are like accounting systems, so they tell us which products in essence carry the greatest amount of embodied energy in their production and their supply chain. But added to that then is needed an evaluation of the use of that product in society. So we would use data to look at its utilization rate, its replacement rate, its future demand. And all this goes into our forecasts that we have to try and get some sense of the role of different mitigation measures to reduce the impact in the future. So it's incredibly data intensive, and it requires a lot of different varying data sources to understand the potential for reduction, as well as understanding the initial impact.
And you already touched on how the vast majority of carbon emissions occur outside of the UK, specifically for most of the products that we import. But at which specific points in the supply chain are carbon emissions commonly produced in the largest amounts?
Yeah, so it is predominantly in the manufacture of the product, not the transportation and movement of it. There's often a misconception that the transport impacts are higher, but they are definitely not. They're usually under 10% and more regularly under 5% of the total impact of it. It is the manufacturing process of new virgin material that carries the predominant impact. And that will vary from product to product. If it's a construction of a particular building, then it will relate more to the carbon intensive materials in it, be it steel, cement, and so on. For other smaller consumer products, it will be that whole manufacturing process of mining precious metals through to the factory that actually assembles that product together. So it is that use of virgin materials and the production of those materials, which in essence carries the majority of the impact, and the fact that they are predominantly virgin materials as opposed to recycled or I suppose recovered materials.
We often hear arguments from the UK to avoid taking responsibility directly for our emissions, citing the fact that without China taking action, changing our habits will not matter. How would you respond to that?
Well, a third of China's emissions are exported to other countries embodied in products. So the fact that China, in essence, is such a large production economy for the benefit of our consumption patterns, I think immediately draws light on potentially where responsibility could sit. The other reality is, and this is going to sound maybe a bit simple, but China is a very large country where a lot of people live, and if we collectively add together all of Europe, for example, we will be still way under half of the population of China. So therefore, there's a simple size issue here, that because you're big, you're going to have a large impact. So what really counts here is our impact on a per capita or per person basis. And if we look at that across developed economies, our emissions are at least twice and often 3 times larger than lots of emerging economies on a per person basis. So the fact that a lot of people live in one country, as opposed to China being divided into lots of smaller countries, and then we wouldn't be able to point our finger so much at China, really highlights often the stupidity of the argument. It is on a per capita basis that counts. And then the final argument on it is who's responsible for climate change over the last 150 so years. A ton of CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a long time, approximately 100 years, if not more. And therefore, all of the emissions associated with our consumption over the last 100 years is now having and still having an effect on global temperature rise and subsequent climate crisis. And it is that contribution that counts. And an excellent website, Carbon Brief, provided a fantastic summary just a few days ago, which demonstrated that we are still in the UK the 7th highest contributor to climate change in the world, based on the fact that we have released these emissions over time. So the fact that we are the consumer, the fact that we have high per capita emissions, and the fact that we have an historical responsibility, I think are key reasons to potentially not always point the finger at China. One thing I would add to that is, though, that I do recognise that China needs to reduce its emissions. And this is where I'd like to move away from us potentially pointing the finger at an individual country and trying to establish how we can collaboratively work together to reduce the impact. So can China make those products more efficiently? But can we use them longer? And can we create an economy which is based around notions of circularity as opposed to the consistent throughput of new materials to meet sort of an ever insatiable sort of appetite for more consumption? And so we all have roles in doing that. And I'd like to see us thinking about what we can do as opposed to who should someone else be doing, what should someone else be doing.
And you hinted at this in your mention of the importance of per capita emissions, but how does this narrative and lack of taking responsibility for our emissions here in the UK also tie into climate justice?
Sure. So the fact that we sort of have responsibility in the UK means that we are likely to concentrate on more supply side changes. So, decarbonising the electricity grid and so on, which also needs to happen. It's never an either or with the climate crisis. It's everything that we have available to us. So it means that we move away from the demand side more, thinking about what we consume. And therefore, it means from a climate justice perspective that we, in essence, take less responsibility for the global challenge to move us towards a rapid reduction in our emissions. And lots of the global scenarios show the need to create and leave carbon space or carbon budgets for less developed countries to develop effectively. And if we don't take responsibility for all our consumer products, we in essence are saying that we deserve a greater percentage of the global remaining carbon pie, if there is such a thing, in that we in essence deserve a greater proportion of what is left. And that to me is clearly linked to discussion on justice and the right to develop and the right for countries in essence to access carbon where it is needed to enable that development. And I think if we don't in essence start to think about consumption and how we can use products differently, we're in essence not exploring the full potential that we could and leaving less and less space for others in trying to address the climate crisis.
Well, now a very big question, but perhaps it's the most important. What can we do to reduce our consumption and carbon emissions on a community-wide and global level, repair related, but also otherwise, as individuals and as communities?
So I suppose I'll make a rather grandiose statement on the global level first, and that is we need to start measuring what matters and how we can deliver that then with considerably less resources. So what our gross domestic product is, our GDP is an incredibly narrow method for us to define whether we are being successful and whether progress is happening. We simply need to start introducing measures which are built around well-being and the ability of society to deliver a high quality of life for everyone without compromising ecological limits. And therefore, a fundamental shift is needed in the way that we understand what our future looks like, and one which is based more around well-being as opposed to a sort of linear model of growth. Now, that's something which we individually will find very difficult to realize. These kind of ideas are embedded strongly within political thinking. But in reality, we can, in essence, live a life or start to try and live the life which is based on well-being and based on, in essence, us as communities functioning to deliver well-being for our community. And that, in essence, relates to, and if we relate this more strongly then to the sort of repair side, it relates to us collaboratively working together to extend the life of products, to be able to make those products available to others that will be of use to them when they're of limited use to ourselves. It ensures that we actually allow and design products in the first place so that we can, in essence, extend their life so that we can either use them ourselves or let them be used by others effectively. And we need to, in essence, enable that at the community level so that we're not just, in essence, becoming part of the problem with this huge global exchange of materials and products flowing around the world constantly. So I think we can start to live what would be described more as a well-being or support a well-being economy at that community level through collaborative working to extend the life of our products.
Following on from that, I mean, this is obviously a theme very dear to us as a European right to repair campaign. And how can the right to repair help us lower our consumption emissions?
Sure, you may be able to answer this question better than me, having had that. I will give you my thoughts, I suppose, because often I'm working at the kind of big government kind of climate policy level, where we've worked actively with government departments in the UK to take resource efficiency and sufficiency seriously. So we've done a lot of work to highlight the potential of doing that. But clearly, the right to repair, in essence, shifts from the constant need to replace products so that we can actually extend the lifetime of them. Without that, we are in essence disposing of products for often quite ridiculous reasons, for one small element of that individual product not working anymore, which could be repaired if the infrastructure is there, and if, in essence, the design is right in the first place that allows it to happen. And in essence, what we're really doing here is moving away and shifting power from companies who wish to try and sell us as much as we can, and in essence, on occasions, ensure that they're designed so that we don't, in essence, we have to replace that product, to one which is focused on us as consumers, which delivers the same service that we are looking for from that individual product, but at considerably less carbon emissions. And there is small replacement of one item. I recently had the charging port replaced on my smartphone at relatively small cost. And now that was about, well, it wasn't that recent, over a year ago. So many people would not have done that and simply gone and bought a new phone. And then the old phone would have just sat in the drawer or ended up in the waste stream. And just the ability now for me to reduce my own individual costs, but extend that life, reduces the need for a new product and the whole supply chain implications associated with that. But as a consumer, delivers exactly the same functionality that I'm looking for from a smartphone. And I haven't had to compromise my quality of life. In essence, I've improved my quality of life by actually not wasting an enormous amount of money on what is a very high priced product. And the carbon benefits of this are obvious and enormous. So to me, it's a win-win situation in a way for both emissions, but also for consumers.
Absolutely. And I just had the charging port of my own phone replaced this week, so I can only agree with you. I wanted to follow up on this before moving on, because I think you have quite strong views on the different approach by manufacturers on their interest in improving energy efficiency in use versus being more reluctant, or I would say from our perspective, lobbying strongly against making changes to the material efficiency of the products. Why is that?
I suppose it's because that's their business model. And their business model is fundamentally flawed when we take into account the kind of scale of reductions that we need to deal with what is a climate emergency. The business model is to sell as much as you can. It's not to necessarily provide the service that is needed to do that. And in essence, that can happen, I suppose. I suppose they would put the focus on the efficiency at the use phase, because that then takes away the responsibility from themselves and in essence places it elsewhere. So that then places responsibility on the decarbonisation of the electricity grid or on battery technology. And again, I'm not arguing against not the decarbonisation of the electricity grid or improvements in battery efficiency and so on. But what we found is that simply isn't enough to actually get the scale of change that we need. So in reality, they lobby because they are trying to protect what is an outdated linear business model, which is a complete throughput of as many materials and products as quickly as they possibly can. And in essence, to do something about this is to stand up to vested interests for both climate benefits and consumer benefits. And that's why, as an individual, it's really difficult to create change. You know, we can do our best in trying to make sure that we use our products and look to repair them. But when we are faced against this enormous sort of machine, which is designed around trying to limit repairability and also to try and sell more and more products, that's where we need leadership at that government level to allow alternative business models to flourish, ones which are based around the delivery of services. And a clear example here is you know, if we stick with the mobile phone, is I'm not overly interested, to be honest, as a consumer. They all reasonably look the same to me now. Now, I know some people would be able to identify the difference between different phones and have a desire for the latest version, but they are reaching a certain level of peak function, which in essence means that we have a more stable product where I'm more interested in the service that it delivers. And it's a service that we could sell, which in essence fundamentally changes the business model from providing that as opposed to trying to provide as many products as we possibly can.
Speaking of solutions of a very different type, what do you think about carbon offsetting? Do you think it's an acceptable solution to individual or businesses' carbon emissions?
I am extremely concerned about offsetting as an excuse to avoid mitigation. There's often called the mitigation hierarchy, where we should do everything we can, in essence, to mitigate. And then whatever residual emissions are left, we do need to address on how we're going to offset or store those emissions. So again, it's not an anti-offset agenda. It's the fact that if we avoid mitigation options because we can claim offsetting, then in essence, we are not really dealing effectively with the climate crisis. And in the study which we just undertook, which was published a couple of days ago, and I believe you've given the link to it already, in our low energy demand scenario work, you know, we show that we can exploit so many different mitigation options that we can reduce the UK's residual emissions to under 50 million tonnes. And then we do need to offset and deal with those emissions, and this is by 2050. One major concern also with offsetting is issues to do with, in essence, effectiveness or longevity of storing those emissions. So permanence is what it's called, and additionality. The permanence issue refers to the fact that if we are using nature-based solutions to absorb them, the growing of trees or other vegetation, then it takes at least 20 years for a forest to be a net consumer of emissions. And then if we're facing serious climate change, we're potentially losing through forest fires the stored carbon, which is assigned to offsets. So it's an incredibly high risk mechanism to use. My other concern is, and this is rather anecdotal because I haven't done the analysis, the amount of adverts we're now seeing, which were advertised as net zero, net negative zero, for a whole range of products. I'm strongly, I would say, concerned that are we all referring to the same acre or hectare of forest? We simply would not have the land area required. And I believe there's been some studies on that which show, you know, that we would need to plant the whole world at least twice to be absorbing this level of carbon. So in reality, it's a last ditch measure which we need to explore once we've explored all other options.
Thank you. And you just mentioned net zero pledges or publicizing commitments. And what do we mean with scope 3 emissions, and why are they so important? And linked to that, why is it that businesses often don't include them when pledging for net zero targets?
Yeah, so scope 1 refers to the emissions that happen on site at a particular factory. Scope 2 refer to the emissions which happen elsewhere but provide electricity. And scope 3 is absolutely everything else. And so there's a lot included under that category. It includes everything from your employers traveling to work, but most importantly, scope 3 includes all of the emissions associated with the downstream impacts associated with that product. So, you know, if you are a furniture maker, for example, that would relate to all of the, let's say there's steel in this particular item of furniture, all of the emissions associated with the making of steel, all the emissions associated with making of fabrics and whatever else has gone into the making of your product as a furniture maker. And if we look at most consumer products, that's where the impact will lie. It is the downstream emissions that are associated with it. There's been advancements, but still major uncertainty in the monitoring and measuring and the ability to comparatively compare one study with the next. People choose their own system boundaries. They have what we call truncation errors. So without getting too technical, we in essence say, well, we can't include all of this impacts. We're going to have to just consider the main materials that go into it. And academic studies have shown that even in the best scope 3 studies, we're often missing about 50% of the impact of the product. So we have problems with measurement. We have problems with the kind of governance system around it. We leave it to individual companies to say whether they think it's good or not. And in reality, they can just completely ignore them as well. So we would encourage companies to engage effectively in understanding the emissions that happen downstream of their sort of process, their factory, whatever it may be, and to actively work with their suppliers to reduce the impact of that. And clearly, the best way to reduce the impact of a product from the consumer element is actually not to buy it, because then you know that there's zero impact associated with it, however efficiently it was produced. And that's where I think the whole repair, reuse side comes in. We're maximizing the use of those products to ensure that we don't even have to buy one which is made at a more efficient rate.
Thank you. And finally, from my side, I was wondering if you could share a case study on longer lasting repairable products that can practically reduce consumption emissions, one that inspires you.
Yes, I suppose I've talked about phones enough, so I will jump from another one. Maybe if it's okay, I'll indulge in not having a consumer product because we've hopefully addressed them enough. So I hope that doesn't stray too far from the topic or people's interests. But I suppose I'd like to think about the enormous embodied energy that could happen potentially in an office building. Obviously to build an office building, we need the foundations, and often it's a steel structure associated with that. And up to about 60% of the impact of the building is embodied within all of the foundations and cement and so on, and the steel frame to do it. And increasingly, we find that we will design these buildings, potentially they could last for hundreds and hundreds of years, but we are knocking them down after 20, 30 years because they no longer meet the functionality that we need, or the potentially look outdated and built in a sort of 1970s modernist style, which splits opinion about whether it's aesthetically nice or not. And what I think is incredibly important about this is our ability to not knock that down, but to redesign that building in a way which keeps its use going longer and longer. And there's been some fantastic examples in London, and I know in Leeds as well, which have in essence kept the whole frame of that building and 60% of embodied energy, but stripped back the rest to allow it to be used flexibly as we change our working habits, but also to make it look entirely different to what it did before. And as the end user, you would never know that you weren't in a brand new building, and you would never know that the foundation and the frame hadn't changed. And what we've successfully done there is take these really carbon intensive materials and ensure that we are using them for as long as possible. And other countries have pushed forward really radical policies on demolition, where you need a really damn good reason to knock down that building. And in the UK, we simply haven't taken the advantage of that. And it really helps us understand how we can extend the life of buildings through simple redesign, but keeping the potentially main structure in place. And I'm quite inspired when I see that happen, and believe there's huge scope for it. So I hope that was okay to extend beyond the consumer product to something a bit broader.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's important what you say, and resonates with many dilemmas that many of us are having in terms of improving the energy efficiency of buildings we might be living in, but also appreciating that the impact of all the resources that you employ in doing that, there's trade-offs that are not obviously very transparent to most of us as individually you making the decisions. So there's a lot more to learn. Thanks for this first round. And I know there's been already quite a few questions in the chat. I'll hand over to Chloe, who will select and ask you questions from those that have been shared, and others feel free to still ask questions if you have them. Thank you, John, for this first part.
Thanks, John. Indeed, we received quite a few questions, so we kind of divided them in different categories. The first one I'd like to ask you is about the role of consumer groups. So someone asked, do consumer groups such as Which in the UK take length of life of products into account enough, according to you? And do you have influence with such organizations?
I'm involved more with understanding and creating scenarios for the Climate Change Committee and UK government and other agencies. So in a way, it's a slightly more anecdotal response to doing that. But one thing that's extremely important here that is defined as a major problem is almost the social legitimacy to act by government. So at the moment, we have a government who prefers pledges to policies. While grand pledges are made, we've yet to see that translate into something real. And one of the major concerns that is faced is whether it is political suicide to start to interfere with the market to ensure that these shifts that we've talked about can happen. And it is consumer groups which in essence help to give that legitimacy by raising the concerns and the rights of consumers, and the campaigning that they do, which I've often included in discussions I've had with government, who put a strong voice forward. But whether the longevity issue is really being raised as much as it should, you may know more than me, but my sense is probably not. But I do believe them to be powerful groups to speak and to demonstrate the need for change.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're seeing something a little bit similar at EU level. But because you mentioned policy and the role of policy, someone asked, what are the policy levers you'd like to see to enable greater repair?
So this to me is not a single policy. It will be a range of policies and could vary across different product groups. So on the construction side, we're looking to try and bring standards in on the sort of maximum embodied energy of buildings, so that then repair becomes more of an option, because there will be restrictions on how new build could move forward. In other areas, it's pressure on individual companies to provide clear guidelines on how to repair and consistent universal design of those to allow their, in essence, the almost democratization of repair to happen, so that it is not a black box and the forcing of doing that. I think the UK government loses quite considerable power to act alone on that, as this is a global market. And when you leave the world, without getting into the Brexit discussion too much, but when I think it's quite clear that if you leave a large trading bloc, you potentially don't have, or you're not part of such a large global voice for change. So potentially that is likely to happen more at the EU level, but hopefully at least not fought against or supported by the UK. I think also is actual innovation and investment in the infrastructure required for it. So we have an industrial sort of policy in the UK, which is giving, there's pots of £150 million for new industrial energy efficiency, when there is actually limited opportunities left to improve the efficiency of UK industry. So therefore, investment in the infrastructure and local repair culture and systems, that £150 million, could you imagine that kind of money going into the infrastructure across every town and city in the country to do that? And to me, that would be money well spent. It would boost local economies. It would help actually provide and ensure that the products are repaired locally. It would simply start to change the language and culture of how we approach the reuse of products. And if governments are willing to invest in sort of energy efficiency in industry, why wouldn't it invest similar in small, medium-sized enterprises to create the necessary governance and infrastructure needed to create change?
Thank you. Thanks, John. I have another one still on policy. I mean, it's not that related to consumption emissions, but it's more on the impact that the links between policymakers and companies. If politicians are financially invested in corporate structures and corporations at the same time just want us to buy more and more, what will create change? I guess that's a bit of the big question, but if you have some insights on that.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's a massive problem. It sort of refers to vested interests and whether governments will truly act in the interests of citizens or act in the interests of further corporate profit. And that doesn't necessarily mean that profit is always a bad thing, but it's the ability, I suppose, it's where interests lie. How do you overcome governments with vested interests in corporations? Wow, I don't know. I have a hope that people will vote for governments that show interest in citizens more and more, that we will actively demonstrate a desire for change through the way we consume, the way we choose to live our lives, the way that we, in essence, protest and become an active citizen for a better world. But I don't think I have the answer on how to necessarily address, I suppose, the strong relationship between politicians and corporations. Sorry.
I think if you did, and if a few of us did, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we're in today.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
I have a question about, the shortening product lifespans. What do you think are the trends that are driving down products' lifetime? For instance, do you think the focus on AI and big data is having an impact on product lasting less long than they used to?
Yes, I'm not going to pretend to be an AI specialist, so but I think that in essence, the product lifetime is not taken into account in the design of the product, and therefore, particularly with certain electrical goods, we're seeing ever-increasing complexity and functionality, and that in itself places additional pressure on the components within that product, and therefore that increased complexity, potentially without product lifetime extension being taken into account in its design, I think is a major problem. And it also then fits in, obviously, very neatly to their model of a product which needs increased replacement. So that obviously needs to be challenged, and that needs to be challenged at a policy level, through lots of the the policy mechanisms that we've already discussed.
And one on the safety related to repair, because it's true that we see this as a big argument and an argument that is often put forward as the campaign. The question is, while it is clear from several studies that extending product lifetime via repairs will have favorable results, do you feel there needs to be some sort of standard to evaluate risk to consumer during/after a repair?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not an expert on consumer standards here, but this is simply health and safety law and the need to check and ensure that we are selling a safe and viable product. And that feels like a very simple agenda to me. We have had health and safety law around electrical products and testing in place for a very long time. And it feels to me that it would not be a huge hurdle to, in essence, apply those standards to ensure that we are providing a safe product and giving the confidence to consumers that they're buying something which is safe and will last. It's also very common now as well, when you buy a second-hand phone, that they will offer a 2-year warranty as part of that. So it's not as if, and so for companies that provide that model, they clearly don't see offering a 2-year warranty as a huge, I suppose, imposition on their business model. They clearly can offer that and function and still feel they can make a profit. So in that respect, it doesn't, to me, feel like it would be an enormous burden and give the consumer the confidence that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think we have only a few questions left. You mentioned that use of virgin materials is one of the key problems. However, we're seeing some manufacturers increasing the range of recycled content, such as aluminium and more. Is this enough, or should we continue to strive for longer lasting products and moving away from overconsumption of new devices? I like this question because this is something we're seeing with the release of new products mainly, and this is the argument that manufacturers often use. So I would really like to hear your thoughts about these arguments that they're promoting.
Ultimately, it is our demand for products that will affect the level of emissions. And if, for example, we were able to use lots of recycled products and just theoretically produce a product with half the impact, if we decide to sell twice as many, we're then back to exactly where we started from. And what we're seeing is an insatiable increase in demand. We're not seeing potentially that curtail at all. And so therefore, yes, it's all the above. Of course, if we have to sell products, I would like to see that product produced with less virgin material. It is not an anti sort of secondary materials argument, but that alone to me does not address the scale of the climate challenge that we face. I still feel that we place the climate challenge around this notion that we have to do something by 2050. If we carry on emitting at the rate that we do, we have used our total carbon budget up to stay within 1.5 degrees within 10 years. We have a decade to act. We don't have 30 years to act. And therefore, that is all the above. That is not just, can we just slightly improve and reduce the impact of more products? And that's why it needs a sort of almost more holistic picture about understanding our whole consumption patterns as well as efficiency of production.
Yeah, I was reading something yesterday that said that we have 99 months left to act, which makes it all the more real, so that every month that is passing, we have 1% chance less or less time at least to act. Going back to consumption emission, what do you think could be done to help people understand the huge role that consumption has in producing emission overseas? So like raising awareness.
Yeah, this is a difficult one because we've worked extensively with WWF and other organizations to try and help provide information and calculators and advice. And I know that they're used by lots of people, but they're predominantly used by people who have an interest in the subject as opposed to sort of wider society. So I really struggle with the fact sometimes that I feel like, and this sounds derogatory, but it's not meant to be at all, but we are often talking to ourselves and persuading ourselves that what we're doing is a good thing to do, and we need that broader reach. And I find that very challenging. So, and I often also find it challenging when this issue is covered, that it's always covered from an individual consumer perspective, like pointing the finger at you, at the consumer, and saying, what are you doing about it? When reality, it's a systemic problem that needs addressing at that sort of larger UK government level. So I would like, in essence, to see government take a lead on having a national debate about what kind of future do we want, and being honest about the kind of changes that we need to make. Otherwise, I think we're working around the edges, and it's very difficult for organisations to make a change. And we can obviously try and be as effective as we can to create that social legitimacy for change. But I think we need some help if we're going to achieve the scale of change that we needed at the speed that we need to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's one last question that was just asked. It's about software, which is, of course, a main challenge. We trash many phones because there are no security updates for the software. Would it be possible to require the producers to give the phone owners the source code to the software if the product no longer wants to, if the producer, sorry, no longer wants to make security updates for the software?
Feels like they've answered their own question, and that sounds like an excellent idea. And I suppose just more broadly speaking, it is about, I suppose, having a government that stands up for consumers. And there is a clear example of just a simple strategy which overcomes an immediate problem, which allows us as consumers to consume differently and to ensure that, I suppose, we can help products last as long as they possibly can.
Thank you for that. I think that was our last question, and we're also running out of time. So I'll pass the mic back to Ugo for the conclusion. And thank you so much again, John, for joining. And thanks to everyone for asking really good questions.
Thanks, Chloe. Thanks again, John, for very insightful and detailed answers to all of our questions. There's a lot of food for thought, and we hope it'll help everyone prepare to celebrate International Repair Day. If you haven't yet, check out openrepair.org/repair-day to find more information about all the activities that are happening worldwide to celebrate the day, and how you can still get involved in person, online, on social media, or simply by repairing something and sharing your experience. We are also thinking about all we just said about the need for longer lasting products and the issues related to software, which are increasingly important. One final plug for the 10-year phone campaign, which is indeed asking everyone to put pressure on the European Union as it is in the progress of legislating on durability of smartphones to make sure that software is taken sufficiently into account, and that policymakers for once are as ambitious as they should be. Without any further ado, thanks everyone again. We will be publishing this webinar both as a video and as a future podcast. So check out the restartproject.org and repair.eu for updates on that. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.